This is breaking news coming in from Eastern Europe, where reports are emerging of a deadly explosion near the Ukraine-Belarus border that has left 4 people dead and several others injured. An incident that has once again raised questions about the growing instability along one of the most sensitive frontiers in the ongoing war. Authorities in Kyiv confirming that the blast took place early Friday morning at a small railway station in the town of Ovruch, located just a few miles from the Belarusian border. Witnesses describing scenes of chaos and devastation as a young man detonated an explosive device when security forces stopped him for an identity check. Ukrainian officials now saying that preliminary investigations suggest it may have been a suicide bombing. The attacker believed to be a 23-year-old man attempting to flee into Belarus, possibly to avoid conscription under the nation's wartime mobilization orders. 4 people killed instantly, including a border guard and a police officer, while several others remain in critical condition. Emergency teams rushing to the scene within minutes. Thick smoke filling the air, shattered glass and debris scattered across the station platform. One witness telling local reporters that the explosion was so loud, it felt like the ground itself split open. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reacting swiftly, calling the bombing an act of cowardice, and a stark reminder that the shadow of war continues to loom over every corner of his country. He vowed tighter security measures and ordered intelligence agencies to probe potential foreign involvement, speculation already mounting about whether the attack could have been influenced or directed by Russian operatives or groups seeking to destabilize border areas, though officials emphasize that no evidence has yet been confirmed. Interior Minister Ihor Klimenko addressing the media saying the attacker appeared trained and equipped, suggesting there might be external assistance involved. Local residents in Ovruch describing a terrifying morning, parents rushing to schools to pick up children, hospitals overflowing with the wounded, doctors reporting shrapnel injuries consistent with a military-grade explosive. The incident now sparking a nationwide security alert with checkpoints across northern Ukraine, doubling inspections and drones patrolling the skies near the Belarusian frontier. Analysts noting that this explosion comes at a time of heightened tension between Ukraine and Belarus. Minsk, having long allowed Russian troops to use its territory to launch attacks into Ukraine, though officially maintaining that it is not a direct participant in the conflict. Ukrainian intelligence services worried that Belarus may become more actively involved as Moscow pushes for broader cooperation. Belarusian officials quickly denying any connection to the blast, calling it an internal Ukrainian issue, but state-run Belarusian media immediately seizing on the story portraying Ukraine as unstable and unsafe, echoing Russian narratives designed to undermine Kyiv's credibility. The timing of the attack particularly sensitive given that North Korea's Foreign Minister Choe has just announced plans to visit both Russia and Belarus at the invitation of their governments. Her trip expected to focus on strengthening strategic cooperation among the 3 isolated nations, raising serious concerns among Western governments about the formation of a new axis of sanctioned states. Observers pointing out that North Korea has already supplied Russia with artillery shells and ballistic missiles used in the Ukraine war, and her visit could signal further military or technological exchanges. Analysts calling this an alarming convergence of interests between Moscow, Minsk, and Pyongyang, all facing international sanctions and all seeking to challenge Western dominance through alternative partnerships. Experts from the Atlantic Council and the Carnegie Center suggesting that these developments are not isolated, but part of a coordinated strategy to reshape the geopolitical balance. Russia providing energy and logistics, Belarus offering strategic positioning, and North Korea contributing weapons and production capabilities. The explosion on the Ukraine-Belarus border, thus symbolically underscoring the volatility of the region at the very moment these authoritarian states are tightening ties. U.S. and European Union officials reacting strongly to the news. The U.S. State Department issuing a statement condemning the bombing and warning Belarus against deepening cooperation with North Korea or Russia. Spokesman Matthew Miller saying any attempt to strengthen military ties among these countries would be deeply destabilizing. In Brussels, EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell echoing similar sentiments, suggesting that new sanctions could be imposed on Minsk if it continues to align itself with Moscow and Pyongyang. Meanwhile, in South Korea, government officials expressing grave concern over Choe's visit, calling it a dangerous move that legitimizes Russian aggression and provides lifelines to regimes under heavy sanctions. The unfolding situation leaving analysts scrambling to assess whether the explosion and the diplomatic visit are directly connected or merely parallel events reflecting a larger global shift. Ukrainian security expert Oleksandr Kovalenko telling local media that whether the bomber acted alone or not, the psychological impact is immense, because it reinforces the idea that the war is no longer confined to front lines, but creeping into civilian zones and border towns. Local residents in Ovruch now living under fear that further attacks might occur. Several families already evacuating to safer areas, teachers instructing students to practice emergency drills, the sound of sirens becoming a grim reminder of their proximity to the conflict. International humanitarian organizations warning that the psychological toll on border populations could be severe, especially as winter approaches and energy shortages worsen. At the same time, global attention shifting toward Belarus's political maneuvering under President Alexander Lukashenko, who continues to balance between direct participation in the war and maintaining internal stability. Some analysts arguing that the bombing could provide Lukashenko with justification to increase border militarization under the guise of security, potentially aligning Belarus even closer with Moscow's objectives. Others suggesting that the government may use the incident to stoke fear and justify further crackdowns on dissent. Meanwhile, Russia remains largely silent on the matter, with Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov merely expressing condolences while emphasizing that Moscow had no involvement. Yet Russian state media quickly amplified reports highlighting alleged chaos in Ukraine and portraying the country as unsafe and disorganized, Western media countering that narrative, pointing to Russia's long history of disinformation campaigns. Security experts saying the proximity of the explosion to Belarus raises legitimate concerns about cross-border networks facilitating such attacks. Ukrainian officials confirming that investigators are analyzing communication data to trace potential contacts of the bomber across the border. Early evidence suggesting he may have used encrypted messaging apps to coordinate his movement, though details remain classified, while authorities continue their probe attention, now turning toward the larger geopolitical tremors caused by North Korea's diplomatic outreach. Experts noting that Pyongyang's engagement with Russia and Belarus fits a pattern of strategic defiance, all three nations increasingly aligning under shared opposition to Western sanctions and narratives. Choe Son-Hui's visit expected to include talks on energy cooperation, possible exchange of industrial technology, and joint statements. Criticizing Western hegemony, international observers viewing this as a calculated step toward building an informal alliance network stretching from East Asia to Eastern Europe, the kind of cooperation that could potentially undermine existing global sanctions regimes. As the news cycle unfolds, major outlets across Europe and Asia dedicating extensive coverage to the border explosion, calling it one of the most serious security incidents near Belarus since the war began. Ukrainian rail services temporarily suspended in the Zhytomyr region as authorities conduct thorough searches for any additional threats, forensic teams combing through the wreckage for traces of explosives. Early analysis suggesting components consistent with military-grade RDX-based material likely smuggled through black market channels, the complexity of the device leading investigators to suspect outside expertise. At the same time, human stories emerging from the tragedy. Families mourning loved ones, medical staff working around the clock, volunteers collecting blood donations for victims. Small acts of courage shining amid the horror, a reminder that even in the midst of geopolitical turmoil, ordinary citizens bear the heaviest burden. Analysts reflecting that this tragedy illustrates how fragile peace remains along Ukraine's northern border, a line separating not only two nations but two worlds. One democratic and struggling for sovereignty, the other authoritarian and entangled in alliances of convenience. The international community now watching closely for Belarus's next moves. Will Minsk distance itself from the violence, or use it as leverage to strengthen ties with Moscow and Pyongyang? Time will tell. For now, the focus remains on investigation, accountability, and the broader implications of a conflict that refuses to stay contained. As the war enters yet another winter, the stakes are higher than ever. The explosion in Ovruch, not merely a local incident, but a symbol of the dangerous interconnections defining today's global tensions. From the streets of Kyiv to the corridors of Moscow and the ministries of Pyongyang, the reverberations of this single blast echo far and wide. A stark reminder that in a world increasingly polarized between blocks of power, even a small act of violence can shift the balance. This is the world we now inhabit, a world where the news of a border town explosion is not just a tragedy, but a warning, a signal of how fragile the current order truly is. Stay with us as we continue to monitor reactions from global leaders and developments on the ground. For now, the confirmed toll stands at 4 dead and at least 12 injured, Ukraine's security service promising a full report within days, Belarus remaining under scrutiny, and North Korea preparing to embark on a high-profile diplomatic mission that could reshape the alliances of the 21st century. This has been a breaking news update on the Ukraine-Belarus border explosion and the unfolding geopolitical landscape that connects it to North Korea's emerging diplomacy with Russia and Belarus, a story that continues to evolve hour by hour, reminding us once again that in the theater of global politics, nothing happens in isolation and every explosion sends a shockwave felt around the world.